that if Malik al-Maut, the angel of death, wanted to come to take their soul, he would not find an open time to do it. The sixth rule, never hate people of faith. This leads to unity among the Muslims and social concord by encouraging love among the Muslims. Number 7, to do one's 5 daily prayers at their proper times. Of course, that reinforces the Sharia. Number 8, not to dirty one's spiritual practice or amal with the vices of egoism, arrogance, tyranny, or self-love in act, word, or deed. That's one of the hard ones. Not to sully our spiritual practice with egoism, arrogance, tyranny, or self-love in act, word, or deed. Number 9, to make one's speech wisdom, hikmah, one's silence, contemplation, tafakkur, and one's vision, deliberation, ittibar. Again, make your speech wisdom, your silence contemplation, and your vision deliberation. Number 10, to know that your salvation is in Allah, His awliya, and the prophets of Allah, and that perdition is in the nafs and what arises from it. Number 11, to avoid backbiting, gossip, and slander. Number 12, do not love the mighty, but love the doers of good and be their companion. Number 13, turn away from the evildoers and love the poor and the Sufis and be one of them. Number 14, to acquire whatever knowledge necessary to bring you close to God. This affirms the spiritual path and teaches one that there is only one ambition in life, and that's to search for Allah. Once he is a disciple, a sincere disciple, or what's called murid sadiq, the faqir of the Jazuliyah looked to his sheikh for all guidance. For his sheikh was thought to have assimilated the consciousness of the Prophet Muhammad to the point where he became a veritable mirror of prophethood. The fully actualized spiritual master was known among the Jazuliyah as a Sheikh al-Wasil, and called one who has arrived at the station of mushahada. He has disappeared into the lights of Kamal and is concerned with nothing but the King of Truth. When he returns among humankind, he returns with illumination, knowledge, and directives to be followed. The Sheikh al-Wasil was indispensable to the disciple because he drew his wisdom from the source of prophecy itself. Al-Jazuli said, "Write down what you hear from me, for I am an intermediary between yourselves and the truth. The truth illuminates and the slave understands. He who is inspired toward the good has an obligation to speak, and his guidance is a benefit to others." And indeed, the fact that the Sheikh acted in such a way means that obeying him was almost a fard. Al-Jazuli said, "He who follows the example of his Sheikh follows the example of his Lord. For the hurma, or sacredness of the Sheikh in respect to his disciples, is like the sacredness of the Prophet before the companions." Al-Jazuli justified these statements by claiming that he was the mujaddid, or renewer of his age. In this case, it would be the 9th Islamic century. And his prerogatives included a right to have divinely inspired discourses. The tradition of the mujaddid, or renewer, comes from a hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud, which says that at the turn of every century, a person will come who will restore religion. This person is a scholar who will restore the original purity of Islam by turning Muslims back toward the prophetic sunnah. It was not difficult for al-Jazuli to portray himself as a mujaddid. By composing al-Khairat and focusing attention on the specifically Muhammadan aspects of inspiration, he was in a favorable position to cast himself as a reviver of the Sunnah. He was also a direct descendant of the Prophet through the Prophet's grandson, Hassan. The fact that he saw himself as a spiritual leader with both doctrinal and social responsibilities meant that al-Jazuli's doctrine of sainthood stressed the authority of the Sheikh as much as intimacy with God. However, he still considered closeness to God, or intimacy with Allah, to be the ultimate fruit of the Sufi way. In the doctrines of Shadhili Sufism, the way of contemplation, or mushahada, which leads to a vision of Allah, is superior to the way of action, or mujahada, which is characterized by outward discipline and self-mortification. For al-Jazuli, this meant that intimacy with Allah was basic for all awliya, from the majdub, or God-addicted lover, to the mujahid or the action-oriented fighter. Al-Jazuli gave proof of his closeness to Allah and the Prophet by transmitting divine inspirations, called in Arabic ilhamat, divine addresses or mukallamat, and conversations with Allah, muhadathat. These served as proofs of his sainthood by confirming his exalted rank as Qutb al-Zaman, or axis of his age. Many of his statements consist of bold declarations of unparalleled spiritual supremacy, both among his contemporaries and in comparison with earlier generations of Sufis. More than a few of these statements include assertions that al-Jazuli was the true successor or Khalifa to the Prophet in his time. These statements were particularly attractive to the poor and disadvantaged in Moroccan society and helped galvanize Morocco against the invasions of the Christians coming from Spain and Portugal and reforming society from within. The most political of al-Jazuli's statements call for a revival of the Muslim community under a divinely guided imam. This imam would reconstitute a city of Allah on earth that replicated the consciousness, if not the exact form, of the Prophet's community at Medina. Many of the Sheikh's statements are replete with double meaning and make use of very ambiguous vocabulary. For example, when he talks about a society of mujtahidun, is he talking about people who strive to carry out Allah's commands, or a group of ulama? When he talks about mujahidun, does he talk about fighters in the way of Allah, or does he talk about people who work hard to reform themselves? Interestingly enough, he calls his tariqah and his own society dawlatuna, our state. Is he talking about a Sufi order, or is he talking about an actual state with a judiciary? And what about his claim that true nobility or sharaf lies in blood descent from the Prophet Muhammad? Let me just read two of these and you get an idea of these statements. One of the statements is this: reputation is not gained through possessions or sons. Instead, reputation comes from one's repute before the Lord of Lords. One is not great because of the glory of wealth and children, rather one is great because of the glory of Allah and His attributes. One is not great because of the greatness of his tribe or love of high rank. Instead, one is great because of the greatness of his nobility, sharaf, in lineage, nasab. He says, I am noble in lineage, ana sharifun fi nasab. My ancestor is the messenger of Allah, and I am nearer to him than all of Allah's creation. My reputation is eternal, dyed in gold and silver. O you who desire gold and silver, follow us, for he who follows us dwells in the heights of Iliyin, in the world and in the hereafter. Another statement: past nations, have asked Allah to be included in our dawla, polity. Yet no one can be included in it until he has first attained sa'ada, salvation or happiness. Our polity is the dawla of those who strive, mujtahideen, and struggle, mujahideen, in the path of Allah, warriors against the enemies of Allah. The kings of the earth are in my hands and under my feet. Al-Jazuli's attempt to control the effects of this charisma did not prevent some Moroccan ulama and even some fellow Sufis from opposing him or disapproving of his statements. Since his opponents were mostly concerned about the symbolic practices of the Jazuliyah, such as shaving the head, wearing distinctive clothing, and strengthening Sufi bonds through the institutionalized practices of ziyarah or visiting other sheikhs, it's clear that what was most threatening was the solidarity of the order. Al-Jazuli was little concerned with these fears and even added fuel to the fire by condemning the ulama for their hypocrisy, especially with regard for their failure to arouse the Muslims in defense of their homeland. Say to the ulama, he told his disciples, how happy you would be if only you were saved. He reserved his most bitter invectives for scholars who, while criticizing him and his followers for their lack of religious knowledge, allowed the common people to slip ever deeper into levels of ignorance and corruption. By living off the wealth of their jobs and doing little to spread their knowledge, these ulama shared responsibility for weakness before the Christian reconquest and for social deviations throughout Morocco. In his Aqidah, al-Jazuli lays such problems as hooliganism, the indiscriminate mixing of the sexes, full body tattooing. We're not talking about the little Bedouin tattoos, we're talking about lions and tigers being tattooed on people. All of this was laid squarely at the feet of the ulama. Rather than wasting their time